Two cowhands slowed their horses on the section road and sat staring for a full minute. One of them called to the other loud enough for the whole quarter section to hear, "Widow's building herself a giant termite nest." The other one laughed and asked if she was expecting a raid. What they saw was a small cabin on open prairie being swallowed, buried from every side in stacked wood so high it covered the windows, so thick on the north face that a man could not have thrown a stone across it. From the road it looked like the work of someone who had lost her mind. Behind the rising wall, a woman in a patched coat was fitting split logs into place the way a mason fits stones, measuring the lean, turning each piece bark side out, pressing her ear to the courses to listen for something only she could hear. She did not look up when they laughed. She did not stop. 2 years before the burial, Ragna Tveit had never touched an axe with intent to split anything thicker than kindling. She had come to Dakota Territory in the spring of 1885 with her husband Peter, a broad-shouldered joiner from Rogaland who could read a plumb line in his sleep, and with their son Ivor, then 7, and their daughter Marta, then 4, all of them riding a converted freight wagon west from the rail depot at Pierre with everything they owned packed in 2 trunks and a canvas sack. The Homestead Act promised 160 acres to anyone who could improve the land and hold it for 5 years. Peter could build, Ragna could work, the children could grow into the life. That was the arithmetic they carried west, and for 2 years it held. The claim sat 12 miles from the nearest rail siding and 7 miles from the town of Ordway, which itself was barely more than a store, a post office, a livery, and a grain elevator that leaned northeast in the wind. The land was open prairie, cut by a shallow creek belt lined with cottonwood and scrub oak, good grass, thin soil, wind that never fully stopped. Peter built the cabin first, 14 by 18 feet, cottonwood frame, rough board siding on 3 walls, and a tar paper patch on the north face that he meant to replace with proper clapboard before winter. 1 iron stove, 1 bed platform for the family, 1 storage chest, 1 small window on the south side, set low to keep the worst drafts above the sleeping line. It was not a house. It was a claim marker with a roof, but it was legal, and the proving up clock had started. They broke 12 acres that first summer. Peter dug a shallow well that gave brackish water, but enough of it. Ragna kept a kitchen garden inside a wind fence made of willow stakes. Iver learned to drive the ox, a broad-dun animal named Kors, who pulled without complaint, but favored his left foreleg in cold weather. Marta gathered buffalo chips for the stove when wood ran short. The second summer brought better wheat and a worse roof leak. Peter patched it twice. He talked about building a proper soddy addition on the north side to break the wind and hold heat. He talked about a root cellar. He talked about a lean-to for Kors. He was a man who planned in sequence, and the sequence was long, and he believed they had time. He was wrong about that. On the 23rd of September, 1887, Peter Tveit drove the wagon to the creek belt to haul back cottonwood rounds for winter splitting. The load shifted on a washed-out track. The wagon tipped. The rounds came down across his right leg below the knee and crushed it against a stump. He dragged himself to level ground and waited 3 hours until a passing rancher found him. The doctor in Ordway set the bone. The wound went septic within 4 days. Peter died on the 2nd of October, with his wife beside him and his children asleep on the other side of a blanket hung from the ceiling beam. They buried him on the claim because there was no money for a town plot, and because Ragna wanted him where the children could find him. The neighbors who came, 4 men and Sarah Kittredge from the next section, helped dig the grave in ground that was already starting to harden. A circuit preacher said words. Then everyone left because everyone had their own winter coming. The deputy from the county seat arrived the following week with the paperwork. Peter's claim could transfer to Ragna as his surviving spouse. She signed. She understood what she was signing. She understood the debt, too. $11.40 remaining from the seed loan, plus a spring order for nails and hinges held on account at Amos Bell's store. She understood that the law gave her the right to stay, and that the land gave her no guarantee she could. She stood in the doorway of the 14 by 18-foot cabin and counted what she had. One lame ox, one cross-cut saw with a bent tooth, one iron stove rated for a room half this size, flour for 5 weeks at half ration, salt pork for 3, a root cellar with 40 pounds of potatoes and a few jars of preserves, $11 and change, and firewood, 1 3/4 cords of split cottonwood stacked under a leaning shed 40 paces from the cabin door. She needed 6 cords minimum to survive a normal Dakota winter in a cabin this poorly sealed. 8 if the winter ran long. 8 if the wind stayed hard. 8 if the north wall kept leaking cold air through the tar paper like water through a sieve. She had less than 2. The temperature had already dropped below freezing at night. The first real snow was maybe 4 weeks away, maybe 3. Ivor asked her what they were going to do. She told him they were going to cut wood. Elias Brandt arrived uninvited on a Tuesday, riding a gray mare and wearing a coat that had survived more winters than most of the homesteads in the county. He was 56 years old, German-born, and had built houses for claimants across the Missouri Coteau for 14 years. He knew lumber. He knew cold. He knew what killed people. He did not dismount at first. He sat the mare and looked at the cabin the way a doctor looks at a wound he already knows will not close. Then he got down, tied the mare, and walked the property in a slow circle while Ragna watched from the chopping stump where she was trying to split green cottonwood with Peder's damaged saw. Brandt stopped at the north wall and pressed his hand flat against the tar paper. He held it there for 5 seconds. Then he walked to the woodshed and counted the rows. He came back to where Ragna stood. "How many cords do you have under cover?" he asked. 1 3/4, Ragna said. "Maybe closer to 2 if I count the rounds I haven't split." "You need 6, at minimum." "I know. You know." He looked at the north wall again. "That tar paper is single ply. The battens are too far apart. In a hard wind, you are heating the prairie. Your stove is small. Your flue draws poorly because the chimney is too short. Your woodshed is 40 paces from the door, and by January the drift line will be higher than that shed roof. You will not reach it in a storm. You will burn what you have inside the cabin, and when that is gone, you will burn furniture, and when that is gone, you will freeze." He said it the way he might read a bill of lumber. No cruelty, just numbers. "I have watched women try to winter alone on claims like this," Brandt said. "The ones who survive do it because they find help or because they leave before December. The ones who stay and fight it alone." He stopped. He did not finish the sentence because they both knew the ending. Ragna set the saw down. Her hands were raw. The green wood had been punishing the blade all morning, and she had maybe a 1/4 cord of rough split pieces to show for it. "What would you do?" she asked. "Sod bank, north and west walls, 3 feet thick, packed tight, sloped for drainage, a bigger stove if you can find one, and help. A man with an axe and a sound horse. You cannot cut, haul, split, and stack 4 more cords alone before the snow comes. It is not a question of will. It is a question of hours in the day. I don't have money for a bigger stove. I don't have money for help. The sod bank takes 2 men and a plow I don't have." Brandt pulled his collar up. The wind had shifted north and there was ice in it. "Then I would consider whether the children would be better served by a mother who walks away from a claim than by a mother who dies on one." He mounted the gray mare and rode out without looking back. Ragna did not watch him go. She picked up the saw and went back to the green cottonwood because stopping meant agreeing with him, and she was not ready to agree. But his numbers sat in her chest like a stone. 2 cords against a 6-cord winter. 40 paces to the woodshed in a blizzard. A north wall that bled heat through tar paper so thin she could see daylight through the seams on bright mornings. Ivor came out with a cup of cold water. He was 9 years old and already reading the weather the way farm children learn to. Not from books,
but from the color of the sky and the behavior of the animals. "Mama," he said, "that man said we should leave." "That man said a lot of things." "Was he right?" Ragnar took the water and drank it. She looked at the woodshed 40 paces away across open ground. She looked at the north wall with its tar paper patches flapping in the wind. She looked at the pile of green rounds that would take her a week to split and would burn too wet and too fast, even when she did. "He was right about the math," she said. "He was wrong about the answer." She did not know what the answer was yet, but she knew the question. It was not how to get more wood. It was how to stop losing so much heat. And those were not the same problem. The idea did not arrive whole. It came in pieces, the way most useful things do on a frontier where no one has time for theory. 3 days after Brant's visit, Ragna hauled an armload of split cottonwood to the cabin in a hard west wind. The gusts caught her in the open and she bent against them, holding the wood to her chest, feeling the cold rip through her coat. She stacked the armload against the south wall outside while she opened the door, because she could not hold both the wood and the latch. When she came back for the stack, she pressed her hand against the cabin wall above where the wood sat. The boards were cool, but not bitter. She moved her hand 2 feet to the right, past the edge of the stacked wood, where the wall was exposed to the wind. The difference was immediate, not subtle, immediate. The exposed wall pulled heat from her palm so fast it hurt. She stood there with her hand on the wall and thought about her father. In Rogaland, on the coast west of Stavanger, her father had built a smokehouse with double walls. The outer wall was planked, but on the windward side he had stacked split birch against it, 4 feet thick in some places, to break the sea wind before it reached the seams. He had taken her there as a girl, maybe 8 or 9, and pressed her palm against the sheltered wall. Then he moved her hand to the exposed side. "Feel the difference," he said. "What steals the heat is not the cold. It is the moving air."
She had filed that away the way children file away things their parents say, without understanding, without urgency, without knowing that 20 years later on a different continent, it would come back as a matter of survival. Now she stood at the south wall of a cabin in Dakota Territory with her hand on boards that should have been freezing and were merely cool, and she understood what her father had been teaching her. The stacked wood was not just fuel waiting to be burned. It was a wall, a dead airspace, a windbreak that happened to contain the next week's heat. She walked the cabin slowly, feeling the walls with both hands. North side, bitter cold, tar paper vibrating in the gusts, frost already forming on the inside surface. West side, cold, boards loose, wind audible through the gaps. South side, where the firewood leaned, cool, quiet. The boards behind the wood were dry. The difference was not small. It was the difference between a wall that fought the winter and a wall that surrendered to it. By evening, she had the beginning of a design. What if the firewood was not stored away from the house, but against it, around it? Not a shed 40 paces away, but a shell, a thick interlocking ring of split wood built directly against the cabin walls, deep enough to block the wind, dense enough to trap still air, accessible enough that she could pull fuel from the inside without opening the main door in a storm. The north and west sides, the killing sides, the wind sides, would get 6 feet of depth. The south side would get 4 or 5. The east side, near the door, would stay lower and narrower for access. She would frame small draw points near the windows, openings where she could reach in from inside and pull dry, sheltered wood straight into the cabin. The outermost wood, the green wood, the wet wood, would serve as the weather layer. The inner wood, the dry wood, the seasoned pieces, would be the fuel she actually burned. She was building a fortress, a ring of timber that served as insulation, windbreak, and fuel supply all at once. When she burned from the inside, the wall would thin, but it would thin inward, leaving the weather shell intact as long as she managed it carefully. The idea terrified her as much as it excited her. If she committed to this, every cord of wood she cut went into the wall, not the shed. There was no backup plan. If the wall shifted and crushed the window, she lost light and ventilation. If the structure collapsed under snow load, she lost everything. If she misjudged the proportions and burned through the insulation layer too early, the shell would become a hollow cage with the wind screaming through it. She was betting the winter on an idea nobody else had tried, built from memories of a Norwegian smokehouse and the feeling of warm boards behind a pile of split birch. She sat at the table that night after the children slept and drew the plan in charcoal on the back of a flour sack. North wall 6 feet deep, west wall 6 feet deep, south wall 5 feet deep, east wall 3 feet, narrowing at the door. 2 draw points, one near the south window, one near a new gap she would cut in the west boards. A sloped cap of scrap boards and hide to shed snow off the top. The math still terrified her. She needed 8 cords to fill this shell. She had less than 2. That meant cutting, hauling, and splitting 6 cords in the weeks before freeze-up, with a lame ox, a bent saw, and 2 children who needed feeding. But the old math terrified her more. 6 cords in a shed 40 paces away, with a north wall so thin the wind came through it like a sieve, and a stove too small to fight back. Even if she got the wood, the distance would kill her. 1 wrong storm, 1 lost path, 1 fall in the dark. She folded the flour sack and put it under her pillow. In the morning she would start. Sarah Kittredge came by on the 4th day, riding her husband's old sorrel. Sarah was 38, had homesteaded the next section with her late husband, and now ran the place with her 2 teenage boys, and an attitude toward advice that made her valuable as a friend and useless as a yes-woman. She watched Ragna stacking split wood against the north wall for 10 minutes before she said anything. "You're building your firewood against the house." "Yes." "On purpose." "Yes." "Ragna." Sarah dismounted and walked closer. She pressed her own hand against the wall, where the stacked wood already reached 3 feet high. Then she looked at the exposed section above it where the tar paper still flapped. She pressed there too. "I can feel the difference," Sarah said, "but that's not the problem." "What is the problem?" "Every log you burn comes out of that wall. By February, you'll have eaten your own insulation. You'll be sitting inside a hollow frame with the wind coming from every direction instead of one. I'll burn from the inside first. The weatherwood stays on the outside. And if it shifts, that stack is already 6 feet tall on the corner. If it leans wrong, it goes through the window. Then you have no glass, no insulation, and a pile of wood inside your cabin you can't move in the dark. I'm going to interlock the courses, like cribbing. You know how to crib? I know how to stack. I'll learn cribbing." Sarah stood with her arms crossed and her breath making clouds in the cold air. She was not hostile. She was the voice of every practical person who looks at an unfamiliar solution and sees only the ways it can fail. "I hope you're right," Sarah said, "but I won't copy you, and I won't tell you I think it's smart, because I don't think it is. I think you're stacking tomorrow's fire outside today's walls and calling it a plan." She rode out. Ragna noticed that Sarah had used almost the same phrase Elias Brandt had. The skeptics were talking to each other. The verdict was forming. She kept stacking. The mockery started the week the north wall reached full height, and the timber ring became visible from the section road. 2 cowhands riding east from the Benton Ranch slowed their horses and sat staring for a full minute. One of them called out to the other, loud enough for Ragna to hear from the far side of the stack. "Widow's building herself a giant termite nest." The other one laughed and said it looked more like a timber fort and asked if she was expecting an Indian raid. They rode on, still laughing. Within a week, the phrase had reached town. Amos Bell made sure of it. Bell was 42, hard-eyed, and ran the only general store in Ordway with a sideline in small lending that kept half the homesteaders in the county on his books.
He held the note on Ragna's spring seed order, $9 against delivery of wheat after harvest. If Ragna abandoned the claim or failed to prove up, Belle could collect against whatever she left behind: tools, wagon iron, the stove, the improvements. He could buy the relinquished claim at discount from the sheriff's sale and resell it to the next hopeful family stepping off the train. He did not wish her dead. He wished her gone. There was a difference, and it mattered to his conscience, and it did not matter at all to Ragna. Bell held court on the store porch most afternoons, a cup of coffee in his hand, and opinions about everyone within 20 miles. When the timber fort story reached him, he turned it into currency.
She's walling herself in with the only fuel she's got, Bell told the men gathered at the hitch rail. Come January, she'll be burning her own walls to stay warm, and come February, she'll be sitting in a hollow ring of snow with nothing left but a stove and a prayer. I give it 6 weeks. A rancher asked if someone ought to talk to her. I did, Bell said. Offered to buy the claim for the debt plus $20. She looked at me like I'd asked to buy her children. Woman's got pride but no sense. Those are the ones the prairie buries. He turned to the store counter and wrote something in his ledger. He was already calculating the value of Peter Tvite's tools. Ragna heard none of this until she came to town herself, 10 days later, to buy lamp oil and salt. She brought Ivor because Marta's cough had worsened and the girl could not ride. Bell was behind the counter when she walked in. 2 men she did not know sat by the stove. The store smelled of coffee, leather, and wood smoke, and the silence that fell when she entered was loud enough to hear. She set her list on the counter. Bell read it without picking it up. Lamp oil, salt, rope. He looked at her. No nails? I don't need nails. Right, because you're stacking, not building. He leaned on the counter with both hands. Mrs. Tveit, I'm going to say something to you that I hope you'll hear. You have a $9 note with me, spring delivery. If you're not on that claim come April, the note comes due against whatever you leave behind. That's not a threat. That's the terms you signed. I remember the terms. Then I want you to think about what happens when that timber fort of yours collapses in January, and you have to walk 7 miles to town with 2 children in a blizzard. I want you to think about what I have to tell the sheriff when he asks why I didn't do more to stop a widow from killing herself and her children with a pile of firewood. Ragna did not raise her voice. She counted out the coins for the oil and the salt and the rope and placed them on the counter. How many steps from your back door to your wood pile? She asked. Bell blinked. What? How many steps? Your store, your wood pile out back. How many? I don't know. 30, 40 maybe. In a whiteout, can you see it from the door? No, but I've got a rope line strung to the... And if the rope breaks, or if the drift buries the shed door, how long do you stand outside in 40 below before your hands stop working and you cannot open a latch? Bell's face hardened. That's not the same thing. It is exactly the same thing. The only difference is that my wood will be against my walls instead of across a yard I cannot cross in a storm. Every piece of fuel within arm's reach of my window. Every piece between me and the wind. It's immigrant foolishness, Bell said. Your husband would have known better. The 2 men by the stove looked at their boots. Ivor, standing behind his mother, went very still. Ragna picked up her supplies. My husband is buried on the claim. I intend to outlive the note. She walked out. Ivor followed. Neither of them spoke until they were past the livery, and then Ivor said, He mentioned Papa. Yes. He shouldn't have done that. No, he shouldn't have. They rode home in silence, and the silence was harder than the wind. The gossip spread the way prairie gossip does, not through malice exactly, but through the relentless need of isolated people to discuss the only stories available to them. By late October, Ragna's timber fort was the most talked about structure in the county, and none of the talk was kind.
Children from the Garrett homestead 2 miles north were sent to ride past and report back on the widow burying her own house. A teamster delivering salt to the livery made a detour to look at it and told everyone at supper that she had stacked wood higher than the roof peak on the north side, and it looked like the cabin was being swallowed.
Ivar heard the mockery. He came home from helping Sarah's boys with hay and told Ragna what the Garrett children had said. His face was tight and careful, the face of a 9-year-old who has learned to hold his feelings behind his teeth. "Everyone thinks you're wrong," he said. "Everyone thought your father was wrong when he filed on this section instead of the one closer to town. He said the creek timber would matter more than the distance. He was right about that." "Papa's not here." "No, he's not." She sent Ivar inside to mind Marta, who had been coughing since the cold snap 3 days before. Then she went back to the stack and kept working. She kept working because the alternative was agreeing with Bell and agreeing with Brandt and agreeing with the cowhands and the teamster and the Garrett children. And if she agreed with all of them, she would have to pack 2 trunks and walk away from the only land she had ever owned and the grave of the man who had brought her to it. There was nowhere to walk to. She had no family in the territory. Passage east cost money she did not have. The charitable options for widows with children meant losing the children to institutional care and losing the claim entirely. She had examined every alternative in the dark hours between midnight and 4 in the morning, and every alternative ended the same way, with nothing. The timber fort was not a plan born from confidence. It was a plan born from the absence of every other option. She was building it because building was the only thing left that was not surrender. She started with the deadfall along the creek belt, wind-thrown cottonwood, some of it half-rotted, some of it sound. The lame ox dragged what it could on a makeshift sledge, but Korz's bad foreleg meant short hauls and frequent stops. What the ox could not move, Ragna moved by hand, rolling the rounds uphill from the creek bottom, levering them with a pole, muscling them across uneven ground until her shoulders burned and her grip failed. The crosscut saw bound in the green wood. The teeth were uneven from the bent tooth Pater had never fixed, and the blade wandered in the cut, wasting motion and eating time. She lost 2 hours on a single cottonwood trunk that should have taken 30 minutes. Her hand split open at the thumb webs on the 3rd day of heavy cutting. The skin cracked where the axe handle wore against the calluses she had not yet built. She wrapped the wounds with cloth strips and kept swinging, the blood soaked through by noon. She rewrapped and kept going. The first hard frost came on October 8th and turned the ground iron. What had been soft footing around the stack became treacherous. She slipped carrying around, and it landed on her shin and left a bruise the color of a thunderhead that did not fade for weeks. Korz went fully lame on October 12th. The ox's left foreleg swelled at the fetlock, and he could not pull the sledge without stumbling. Ragna walked the rounds herself that day, rolling them uphill from the creek bed, 200 yards of uneven ground, 1 log at a time. She moved 9 rounds in 8 hours. She needed 90 more to finish the north wall alone. By October 10th, the north side was 1/3 stacked. The courses were rough, she was learning as she built, and the early layers showed it. The corners were too straight. The weight was settling unevenly. A section near the northeast angle slumped outward overnight after a rain, scattering 2 days of work across the mud. She restacked it. She tried to lean the courses inward, the way she had seen fence builders lean their rails, but the logs rolled on each other, and the wall bulged in the middle. She needed a technique she did not have. Then Amos Bell made his second move. He bought up every cord of dry-seasoned wood available in Ordway and the surrounding ranches, not to burn it, to own it. He offered cash, which no one could refuse, and within a week there was no dry firewood for sale within 15 miles of Ragna's claim at any price she could reach. Green wood from the creek belt and scavenged deadfall were all that remained. Greenwood burned wet and fast and left the stove hissing with steam. It was barely half as efficient as seasoned wood, which meant she needed even more of it to fill the same wall. The math was getting worse. That was when Halvor Nesheim appeared. He was 62 years old, Norwegian-born, from Hardanger, a former sawyer and freight hauler who had run timber down rivers in Wisconsin before the work broke his back and the loneliness broke his marriage. He lived alone in a dugout half a day's ride south, trading lamp oil and mending harness for a living that was barely a living. He had come to Ordway for supplies and taken the long way back because the creek road was less rutted than the section line. He saw the slumped corner from 200 yards out. He saw the cabin disappearing inside a rising ring of stacked wood. He saw a woman with wrapped hands wrestling a cottonwood round into position on a wall that was already taller than she was. He did not stop because he was kind. He stopped because he recognized something. The stacking pattern was wrong, but the principle was sound. The woman was not building randomly. She was building with purpose, and she was failing only at the joinery. He tied his mule and walked to the collapsed corner without introducing himself. He stood over the scattered logs and looked at the courses below them, the ones that had held. "Your corners are too square," he said. "Square corners push. Round wood in a square corner will always spill." Ragna straightened up and looked at him. He was tall, gaunt, white-bearded, with hands that told his whole history, scarred, thick-knuckled, one finger missing at the second joint. "Who are you?" she asked. "Halvor Nesheim. I ran timber in Wisconsin. I know why your corner fell." "Tell me." He crouched down and picked up two of the scattered pieces. He laid them perpendicular, overlapping at the ends. Then he took two more and reversed the pattern, locking the first pair in place. "Cribbit," he said. "Alternate long and short. Every 2 layers, the pattern reverses. The mass locks itself. You don't need nails. You need patience and a system." He restacked the corner in 20 minutes. The difference was visible immediately. The interlocking courses gripped each other. The weight settled inward instead of pushing outward. "Now," he said, "every 2 layers tilt inward by a finger width. When the wall settles, it tightens. If you build straight, it loosens. Cold and rain will test every joint you make. Give them something to tighten against." He did not leave that day. He stayed through the afternoon, working beside her, correcting the angle of each course, showing Ivor how to sort the pieces by length, so the interlocking pattern would hold without forcing. He showed Marta how to carry the shortest pieces to the stack without tripping on the uneven ground. He taught one more thing before he rode out at dusk. He pulled a green round from the outer layer and a dry split piece from the inner layer and held them up side by side. "Your firewood and your weatherwood are not the same wood," he said. "The driest pieces go nearest the draw points where you can reach them from inside. The greenest pieces, the wettest pieces, the heaviest rounds, those go on the outside. They are not fuel, they are armor. When you burn inward. The shell stays." Ragna asked him to come back. He said he would think about it. He came back 3 days later with a draw knife and a splitting wedge he had made from a wagon spring. He did not explain why he returned. He did not need to. He had seen competence, and competence was the only currency that mattered to a man who had spent his life around people who could build. The second day, Halvor taught her something she had not thought to ask about. He stood at the northwest corner, the point where the 2 deepest walls met, the corner that would take the worst punishment from the prevailing winter wind, and he pressed his ear against the stacked wood. "Listen," he said. Ragna leaned in. She heard nothing, just the muffled quiet of dense wood packed tight. "Now come here." He walked her around to the northeast corner, where the stacking was newer and the courses not yet fully interlocked. She pressed her ear to the wood.
She could hear the wind moving through the gaps, a thin, high whistle like breathing through teeth. When you cannot hear the wind, the wall is working, Halvor said. When you can hear it, the wall is lying to you. It looks solid, but it leaks. Every gap you can hear is heat you will lose. He showed Ivor how to plug the gaps with bark strips and wedge pieces. The boy worked at it with the focus of a child who understands, without being told, that the work is real and that his part of it matters. Halvor's third lesson came the day after, when Ragna wanted to start the draw point near the south window. She planned to leave a hole in the stacked wall, framed with scrap boards, wide enough to pull a split log through from inside.
Not a hole, Halvor said. A channel. Angle it downward from outside to inside. Rain and snow melt run out instead of in. And make the opening smaller on the outside than the inside. Wind follows the wider path. If the outside is narrow, the wind skips over it. He framed the first draw point with her, using pieces of the broken fence rail from the old property line. The channel angled down by 2 finger widths across its length. The outside opening was 8 inches wide. The inside opening was 12. When Ragna reached through it from the cabin, she could grip a split log and draw it in without opening any door, without stepping into any wind, without losing more than a breath of warm air. It was a small thing. It was the most important structural detail in the entire design. If you've ever had someone see what you were doing when nobody else could, tell us in the comments. Because what Ragna built next would need every lesson Halvor brought. By October 24th, the west wall reached window height. The cabin was disappearing. From the section road, only the chimney pipe and the roof peak were visible above the rising timber ring. Smoke rose from the chimney into gray October skies, and to anyone passing it, looked like the earth itself was smoking, a mound of wood with a thin line of heat escaping from its core. By November 2nd, the first draw point was framed and functional. Ragna pulled a test log through it at midnight during a wind gust and felt the cabin lose nothing. The stove kept its heat. The draft held steady. She fed the fire without stepping outside. For the first time in weeks, something worked exactly as she had imagined it. By November 18th, the south shoulder was finished, and the east side, the door side, the access side, was still dangerously open. The east wall was only 2 courses high, barely knee-level because she had run out of close timber, and Cors could not haul from the far creek bottom with his bad leg. The temperature had dropped below freezing every night for 3 weeks. The creek was icing at the edges. The first real snow, not a dusting, not a squall, but a solid ground-covering fall, was days away. Maybe hours. Ragna had a design, a mentor, and the skeleton of something that might save her family. She did not have enough wood. She did not have enough time. She did not have a single neighbor who believed the timber fort would do anything but entomb her. But the corners held now. The courses locked. The draw point worked. And every night, when she pressed her hand against the inside of the north wall, the boards behind the stacked wood were cool and quiet, while the exposed boards above the stack line howled with cold. The wall was working. She could feel it in her palm, the same way she had felt it against her father's smokehouse 30 years ago on the coast of Rogaland. She just could not yet know if it would work enough, and the sky to the northwest was turning the color of lead. The first real snow came on November 21st, 3 days after Ragna finished the south shoulder. It did not arrive gently, it arrived sideways, driven by a northwest wind that stripped the grass flat and turned the air white before noon. She was stacking the east wall when it hit. 2 courses high on the door side, barely enough to break a draft at ankle height. The wind came over the low stack and slammed the cabin door so hard the upper hinge bent. She fought it closed and barred it, and stood in the dark, listening to the storm find every weakness in the structure she had built. On the north side, Where the wall was 6 feet deep and tightly cribbed, the sound was remarkable. Not silence. Nothing is silent in a Dakota blizzard, but a muffled, distant roar, as if the wind were happening to someone else. The boards behind the stacked wood did not vibrate. The frost line on the inner wall stayed where it had been at dawn. The stove held its heat without extra feeding. On the east side, where the wall was knee-high and gapped, the wind came through like a blade. The temperature near the door dropped so fast that the water bucket froze to the floor within an hour. Ragna hung a blanket across the east end of the cabin and stuffed rags along the bottom. It helped the way a bandage helps a broken bone. It covered the wound, but did not fix it. The storm lasted 2 days. When it broke, Ragna went outside and walked the perimeter. The north wall had caught the snow the way a dam catches water. A drift rose against the outer face, packed hard by the wind, but the wood itself had held. No courses had shifted. No corners had spilled. The interlocking pattern Halvore taught her had locked tighter under the pressure, exactly as he said it would. The snow that reached the cabin wall behind the wood was powder soft, not the driven ice that scoured exposed surfaces. She brushed it away with her hand. The west wall had taken punishment at the top course, where the capboard shifted and let snow sift into the upper layer. She would need to reset them. But the lower courses were solid. The south wall was clean, sheltered by the deeper north and west walls. It had barely been touched. The east wall was a disaster. The 2 courses she had managed were half buried and shifted. Snow had packed into the cabin from under the door. The hinge was damaged. The door frame had warped from the moisture and the cold. She had proof of concept and proof of failure in the same morning. The timber fort worked where it was complete. Where it was not, it was worse than having nothing at all, because the wind that the deep walls redirected had to go somewhere, and it went around the corners and hammered the open side with concentrated force. She needed to close the east wall. She needed to do it before the next storm, and the next storm, in late November in Dakota Territory, could be hours away. Halvore arrived the morning after the storm broke, riding his mule through drifts that reached the animal's chest. He did not ask how she had fared. He walked straight to the east wall and stood looking at the damage with the expression of a man counting costs. "The wind funneled," he said. "Your deep walls on 3 sides turned the open side into a throat. The air accelerated through the gap. I know. You need to close it today. I know that too. I don't have the wood." She had burned through the inner ring on the north side during the storm. 4 days of fire had consumed what she estimated at a quarter cord. The remaining close timber along the creek belt was buried under snow. Cores could not haul in drifted ground. The deadfall she had planned to scavenge from the fence line was now under 2 feet of wet, heavy snow that would take days to clear. Halvore looked at the leaning woodshed 40 paces away, the original shed, now useless, its door frozen shut and its roof sagging under the snow load. "Tear it down," he said. "The shed? You have wood standing in a structure you will never reach in a storm. Take it apart. Stack it where it matters." It was obvious once he said it. The shed was 8 feet by 6, built from cottonwood planks and cross pieces. Not split firewood, but solid lumber, enough to crib a wall 3 feet deep across the east face of the cabin, if she used the planks as the structural frame and packed the gaps with snow and whatever scrub she could dig out. They worked together for 2 days. Halvore pried the shed apart with a bar, while Ragnar hauled the planks to the east wall. Iver carried the smaller pieces. Even Marta, whose cough had eased but not gone, dragged cross pieces through the snow, her small hands red inside mittens that were already too thin. The east wall that rose from the shed's bones was not as deep or as tight as the other 3 walls. It was 3 feet thick instead of 6,
and the lumber was longer and flatter than split rounds, which meant fewer interlocking surfaces. But Halvore framed it with the same cribbing pattern, and they packed the outer face with snow that froze solid overnight and became, in effect, a cement of ice. By November 25th, the cabin was fully enclosed inside its timber ring. From the outside, it had vanished entirely. A mound of wood and snow, with a chimney pipe rising from its center and smoke drifting into a sky the color of dirty wool. Ragna stood at the section road and looked at what she had built. It did not look like a house. It did not look like a fort. It looked like something the prairie had swallowed and was trying to digest. She went back inside and fed the stove from the south draw point. The dry wood came into her hand smooth and cold. The cabin was dark and cramped and smelled of smoke and wool and children. The walls did not move. For the first time since Peter's death, she did not feel the wind directly on the cabin skin. She felt its absence, the quiet that lived behind 6 feet of interlocking wood. Early December brought a deceptive calm. The temperature dropped steadily, below zero most mornings, climbing to single digits by afternoon, but the wind stayed moderate and the snow fell straight instead of sideways. Inside the fort, the early signs were promising enough to frighten Ragna, because hope on the plains was the fastest road to carelessness. She tracked the stove's performance the only way available to her, by armloads burned per night. In the exposed cabin before the wall, she had burned 6 to 8 armloads between sundown and dawn on a cold night. Now, behind the completed timber ring, she burned 4, sometimes 3 on calm nights. The wood lasted longer because the stove did not fight the wind for control of the room. The water bucket by the bed no longer froze solid overnight. It crusted with ice on the surface, but the water beneath stayed liquid. She could pour it in the morning without thawing the bucket over the fire first. The frost line on the inner walls had retreated. The north wall, the killing wall, the one that should have been coated in ice crystals from October to March, showed frost only at the ceiling joint where the timber ring did not reach. Below that line, the boards were cool to the touch, but dry. She tested the draw points daily. The south point pulled clean. She could reach in, grip a split log, draw it through the angled channel, and feed the stove without opening any door. The west point was tighter. Snow had settled around the outer opening, but it still functioned. She kept both channels clear with a broom handle, but the skeptics were not finished. Elias Brandt rode out in the first week of December. He had not come to apologize. He had come to verify his own prediction. He walked the perimeter slowly, pressing his hand against the outer face of the timber ring the way he had pressed it against the tar paper 2 months earlier. He crouched at the corners and examined the cribbing. He looked at the capboards and the snow load on the upper courses. He went inside and stood in the center of the cabin and looked at the walls and the ceiling and the stove. "The frost line is lower than I expected," he said. He did not say it warmly. He said it the way a man reads a measurement that contradicts his estimate. "One mild stretch does not make a winter," he said. "January is when false confidence kills people. You're burning less wood now because the wind has been moderate. When it comes hard, when it comes at 40 below with a north wind that does not stop for a week, the question is whether that outer ring can hold, or whether it compresses, shifts, and opens gaps that turn your shelter into a chimney." "The corners are cribbed," Ragna said. "They tighten under load." "Cribbing holds until it does not. I have seen log structures that held for years and then came apart in a single night because the settlement reached a tipping point. You have green wood in that wall. Green wood shrinks. When it shrinks, the courses loosen." He was not wrong. He was wrong about whether she had a better option, but he was not wrong about the risk. Every word he said was a word she had already said to herself in the dark hours. "I will watch the settlement," Ragna said. "Halvor showed me how to read it." Halvor Nesheim is a sawyer, not a builder. He knows wood the way a butcher knows cattle. That does not make him an architect. He rode out. Ragna watched him go and felt the cold certainty of doubt settle back into her stomach where it had lived since October. Sarah Kittredge came by the next day with a jar of preserved plums and a warning. Amos is telling people your fort will be your coffin, Sarah said. He says when the big cold comes, the wall will crush inward and trap you. He says the whole thing will burn like a bonfire if a spark gets into the outer wood. Has he been here to look at it? No, he doesn't need to look at it. He just needs people to believe him. Do you believe him? Sarah set the plum jar on the table and looked at the north wall. She pressed her hand against it the way everyone did. The gesture had become the test, the proof that could not be argued with. I believe you have done something I do not fully understand, Sarah said, and I believe January will tell us whether that is enough. The weather held through the second week of December, cold but manageable, snow but not storm, wind but not the killing kind that turns the air to knives and erases the line between ground and sky. Ragna used the calm to shore up the weak points. She reset the capboards on the west wall with heavier poles. She packed new snow against the east wall where the ice cement had cracked. She pulled the driest inner wood to the front of both draw points and rotated the greener pieces outward. She counted what remained. The count was not good. She'd started the season with close to 7 cords inside the timber ring, less than the 8 she wanted, but more than the 6 she needed. The November storm and the daily burning had consumed just over a cord. That left her 6 cords with the worst 3 months of winter still ahead. 6 cords for a stove that burned 3 to 4 armloads a night. Each armload was roughly 1/15 of a cord, 15 nights per cord. 6 cords, 90 nights. January, February, and half of March equaled roughly 90 days. The math was exactly even. There was no margin. Every log she burned was borrowed against a March she had not yet survived. If the cold ran long, if the stove burned hot, if she had to open the main door for any reason and let the room go cold, if Marta's fever returned and the fire had to run all day, she would come up short. She could not afford a single wasted log. She could not afford a single night of carelessness. She told Ivor to count the armloads each morning. He took the task seriously, scratching the number into the back of the door frame with a nail. The marks accumulated. A record of survival, one night at a time. On the 16th of December, the sky went blue, not winter blue, the soft, pale blue of a mild day, but a hard, metallic blue that made the snow glare and the air feel thin. The wind stopped entirely. The smoke from the chimney rose straight up like a thread pulled to the sky. Halvor had told her about days like this. Dead calm days in December meant the air was settling, the pressure was building, and something large was organizing itself to the northwest. On the plains, perfect stillness was not peace. It was the held breath before the storm. The temperature dropped 14 degrees between noon and sunset. By dark, it was 20 below. By midnight, it was 32 below, and the wind had not yet started. It started at 4 in the morning, not gradually, not with gusts that built. It arrived all at once, a wall of moving air so cold it hurt to breathe and so loud it drowned the stove's crackle, and Marta's coughing and the creak of the roof poles bending under pressure. The 60-day freeze had begun. The first 3 days were the worst because they were the first, and Ragna had never experienced cold like this from inside a structure she had built herself with no guarantee it would hold. The wind did not stop. It did not weaken. It ran straight from the north-northwest at a constant howl that turned the air outside into a moving wall of ice crystals. Visibility dropped to nothing. The world beyond the timber ring ceased to exist. Inside the fort,
The cabin responded the way the small tests had promised, but at a scale that felt like a different experience. The north wall, 6 feet of interlocking wood backed by a drift that had frozen into a solid rampart, absorbed the wind's first force. The sound that reached the cabin boards was deep and distant, a vibration more than a roar. The temperature on the inner surface of the north wall was cold but not bitter. Ragna pressed her hand to it every few hours, the way she pressed a hand to a child's forehead checking for fever. The west wall held. The east wall, the weakest, the newest, the one built from shed lumber and ice cement, creaked. On the second night, Ragna heard a sound from the east wall that made her stomach drop. A low, grinding shift, like something heavy settling. She pressed her ear to the boards and heard the courses adjusting against each other. Not collapse. Not yet. But movement. She woke Ivor and had him hold the lantern while she inspected the east draw point from inside. The channel had narrowed. The outer courses had shifted a finger width inward, pinching the opening. She could still reach through, but the margin was smaller. If it shifts again, will it close? Ivor asked. I don't know. What do we do if it closes? We use the south point. What if both close? Then we open the door and work fast. She did not sleep the rest of that night. She sat by the stove with her hand on the east wall and listened to the fort absorb the storm, the way a body absorbs a beating, with creaks and groans and small concessions that were not surrender but were not comfort either. On the morning of the third day, Marta spiked a fever. The girl had been coughing for weeks, the wet, rattling cough of a cold that would not release its grip, but now the cough deepened and the fever rose and her skin went from pale to flushed in an hour. The room could not go cold, not for an hour, not for 10 minutes. A child with a fever in a cabin that drops below freezing will not recover. She will get worse and worse, and the cough will settle into her chest, and the chest will fill, and then it is not a cold anymore. It is pneumonia, and pneumonia on the plains in winter, 12 miles from the nearest doctor, is a death sentence delivered by inches. Ragna fed the stove from the south draw point. She pulled the driest logs she could reach and fed them one at a time, keeping the firebox hot but not blazing, because a blaze consumed wood faster and she could not afford fast. She soaked cloths in the water bucket and laid them across Marta's forehead. She boiled broth from the last of the salt pork bones. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, the stove ticked and the girl breathed in ragged, wet gasps, and the fort creaked on its east side and held on its north side, and the temperature held at something that was not warm but was not killing. The fever lasted 4 days. 4 days of burning extra wood because the room needed to stay above freezing at all times, not just overnight. 4 days of armloads that Ragna counted, and Ivor scratched into the door frame, and both of them knew were eating into the margin they did not have. When the fever broke, Marta was lighter by several pounds, and her eyes were glassy, and she slept 18 hours straight. Ragna sat beside her and did the math. They had burned through a cord and a quarter in the first week. That pace would exhaust the wall in 5 more weeks. The freeze was not going to last 5 weeks. It was going to last 8, maybe 9, maybe longer. She needed to slow the burn rate. She needed the wind to drop. She needed the east wall to stop shifting. She needed at least one of these things, and the storm gave her none of them. While Ragna counted armloads, the storm was doing its work across the county. Sarah Kittredge's woodshed path vanished twice a day. Her older boy, Thomas, 17, strong and sure-footed, had to re-break the trail each morning and each evening, working in wind that pushed him sideways and snow that filled his tracks before he reached the shed door. Each trip took 20 minutes in conditions where exposed skin froze in 5. A bachelor homesteader named Lund, 3 sections east, died on the 8th day. He walked from his cabin to his woodpile, 22 yards, a distance he had covered 1,000 times in a whiteout that erased the world. He missed the pile. He walked past it. They found him 60 yards farther on, face down in a drift, frozen solid. 22 yards, a distance a healthy man covers in 30 seconds on a calm day. The wind made it infinite. Amos Bell's clerk, a young man named Reese, nearly lost 2 fingers fetching wood behind the store. He had gone out without gloves because the gloves were in the shed, and the shed was behind the store, and the trip was only 40 paces. He came back with white fingers and a face the color of candle wax. The doctor saved the hand, but the fingers never fully bent again. Elias Brandt, the authority skeptic, the man who had told Ragna to build a sod bank and hire help, moved his mother's bed to the center of his own house because the north wall leaked heat so badly that the temperature on that side of the room dropped below freezing while the stove was burning. His house was properly built. Board siding, sod bank, good stove, and the north wall still bled. The contrast mattered. It mattered because Ragna was counting armloads and worrying about burn rate, while her neighbors were fighting the same battle with conventionally built shelters and losing. Distance killed Lund. Distance nearly crippled Reese. Brandt's sod bank, the method he had prescribed for Ragna, was failing to hold heat in his own house. The fort's logic, put the fuel against the walls, eliminate the distance, let the mass break the wind before it reaches the boards, was proving itself not through theory, but through the accumulating evidence of what happened when you did not do those things. Ragna did not know about Lund's death or Reese's fingers. Not yet. She was sealed inside the timber ring with her children, counting logs, listening to the east wall creak, and keeping the stove alive. The second week brought a lull. The wind dropped from a roar to a moan. The temperature climbed from 30 below to 15 below, which felt almost warm by comparison. Ragna opened the main door for the first time in 8 days and looked out at a world she barely recognized. The drift against the north wall reached the top of the timber ring. The east side was buried to the capboards. The section road had disappeared entirely. The sky was gray and low and promised more. Halvore appeared during the lull. He came on foot because his mule could not break through the drifts. He was breathing hard, and his beard was frosted white, and he looked 10 years older than he had in November. He did not come as a savior. He came as a witness and as a teacher who needed to see whether his teaching had held. He checked the east wall first. The shift was visible. The upper courses had moved inward by 2 finger widths, and the ice cement on the outer face had cracked in a jagged line from the capboard to the base. "It is settling," he said, "not failing. The courses are finding their weight. But you need to shore the top." He climbed the drift on the east side and restacked the upper 3 courses with Ivor handing pieces up from below. He wedged cross pieces between the capboard and the highest course to distribute the snow load. It took 2 hours. His hands shook by the end, not from cold, but from the effort and the age in his body that he could no longer override with will. Inside, warming by the stove, he looked at Ivor's marks on the doorframe. "How many per night?" he asked. 3.5, sometimes 4 when Marta was sick." 3.5 is good. Most houses this size burn 5 or 6 in this cold. "We don't have enough at 3.5, Ragna said. "Not if this lasts 2 more months." Halvor looked at the wall the way he looked at all problems, as a structure with knowable properties. When the weather breaks again, even briefly, you can reclaim wood from the outer ring where the drift has packed against it. The drift itself is insulation now. It does the work the wood was doing. Where the snow is packed solid against the cabin wall, the wood in front of it can be moved to the draw points without losing protection. It was the kind of thinking that separated a man who understood materials from a man who merely used them. The snow was not just weight and obstruction. It was a building material. Packed snow insulates. Driven snow, frozen solid against a surface, becomes a wall of its own. The timber ring had caught the snow and held it in place, and now the snow was returning the favor. "Watch the corners," Halvor told Ivar. "Not the faces. Structures tell the truth at the corners before anywhere else." He left the next morning before the wind picked up again. Ragna did not know it, but it was the last time he would help her during the freeze. The third week was the worst. The temperature dropped below 40 on 3 consecutive nights. The wind returned at full force and did not break for 5 days. The stove consumed wood faster than any stretch before because the cold was deeper and more persistent, and the cabin fought harder to hold what heat the stove gave. The east wall shifted again. This time the sound was loud enough to wake Marta. A deep, wooden groan like a ship's hull in heavy seas. Ragna leapt from the bed platform and pressed her hand to the east boards. The surface was vibrating. Outside, the courses were adjusting under the combined load of wind and snow and their own settling weight. The east draw point closed. The shift pinched the channel shut. She could no longer reach through to pull wood from the east side of the ring. She had one draw point left. The south point, where the wall was 5 feet deep and the snow load was lighter, and the courses had been the most carefully cribbed because Halvor had built that section himself. One draw point, one channel between her family and the fuel. If it closed, she would have to open the main door in conditions that had killed a man 22 yards from his own cabin. She did not tell Ivar how frightened she was. She told him to count armloads and watch the south wall's corners, and he did. The south draw point held. It held because Halvor had cribbed that section himself, and because the south wall had never taken the direct force of the north wind, and because the snow load on that side was lighter and more evenly distributed. Every morning Ragna reached through the channel and pulled in what she needed. Every morning she expected the channel to resist, to narrow, to pinch shut the way the east point had. Every morning it gave her wood. But she was burning the inner ring now, the dry seasoned pieces closest to the cabin. Each log she pulled was a layer removed from the barrier between the boards and the winter. She could feel the wall thinning. Not with her hands, the courses were still deep enough that she could not reach the outer face from the draw point, but with her knowledge of what was there and what was leaving. She reclaimed wood from the north side as Halvor had instructed. Where the drift had packed solid against the outer timber ring, the snow itself was doing the insulating work. She pulled 2 courses of logs from behind the drift line and moved them to the south draw point. It was delicate work, pulling from the middle of a load-bearing wall without disturbing the courses above it, and she did it in stages, one piece at a time, feeling for the weight, shift the way Halvor had taught her to listen for the wind. The 4th week brought temperatures that made the earlier cold seem moderate. The thermometer at Brant's place, the only one within miles, read 44 below on the coldest morning. At 44 below, the air itself becomes an adversary. Moisture freezes in the nostrils. Skin exposed for 90 seconds will blister. Spit freezes before it hits the ground. Inside the fort, the cabin held. It held at 32 degrees, not warm, not comfortable, but above freezing. Ragna kept Marta wrapped in every blanket they owned and slept with Ivar pressed against her for warmth. The stove burned through the night, and she woke every 3 hours to feed it because letting the fire die meant letting the temperature crash, and recovering from a crash cost more wood than maintaining a steady burn. She developed a rhythm. Feed the stove at 10. Sleep. Wake at 1. Feed. Sleep. Wake at 4. Feed. Stay up. Wait for the gray light that passed for dawn in January on the northern plains. Ivar kept the count.
He scratched the marks into the door frame with the focus of a boy who understood, without anyone telling him, that counting was the only power they had. If you're invested in this story, subscribe and stay with us, because what happens next in the dead center of the worst stretch of cold will test everything Ragna built. On the 29th night, Ragna heard a thud against the east wall, not the settling groan she had grown used to, a single heavy impact, like a body falling against wood. She lay still and listened. The wind filled the silence. Then it came again, not a structural sound, a human sound, a fist hitting wood. Someone was outside. Someone was outside in 40 below wind in the dark, hitting the wall of the timber fort because they could not find the door. She pulled on her coat and boots. Iver sat up on the platform, his eyes wide. "Stay with Marta," Ragna said. "Keep the stove fed." She unbarred the door. The wind hit her like a wall of broken glass. The cold was so immediate and so total that for a moment she could not breathe. She could not see. The world was white and roaring and directionless. She kept one hand on the door frame and reached out with the other. Her fingers found the edge of the timber ring 2 feet from the door. She worked along it, hand over hand, feeling the stacked wood under the snow, counting her steps. 4 steps along the east wall, she found him. Thomas Kittredge, Sarah's older boy, 17 years old, on his knees in the drift with his hands against the wood and his face covered in ice. He was not unconscious, but he was close. He was making sounds that were not words. He had been heading to his family's woodshed. He had missed it. In the whiteout, he had walked past the shed, past his own fence line, and kept walking until he hit the first solid object between his mother's claim and the horizon, the timber fort, 3/4 of a mile from where he started. Ragna hauled him through the door. He was heavy and stiff, and his clothes were frozen into a shell around his body. She got him to the floor near the stove and pulled off his boots. His toes were white, his fingers were white, his cheeks were waxy and hard. She heated water, not hot, warm, and wrapped his hands and feet in soaked cloths. She put a blanket over him and fed the stove until the cabin was warmer than she had kept it all winter. She burned 4 extra armloads that night. She did not care about the math. Thomas came around by dawn. The color returned to his fingers. His toes were damaged. 2 of them would blacken later, but he was alive. He looked at Ragna with the dazed clarity of someone who has been very close to dying and knows it. "I couldn't find the shed," he said. "I couldn't find anything. I just kept walking. You found the wall. I didn't know what it was. I just hit something solid and I stopped." 50 feet. That was the distance between Sarah Kittredge's cabin and her woodshed. 50 feet that Thomas had missed because the wind and the snow erased every landmark and every sense of direction and every assumption about where the world was. He had walked 3/4 of a mile in the wrong direction because 50 feet might as well have been 50 miles in a whiteout. Distance kills. It was the principle Ragna had built the timber fort to solve, and it had just saved a boy who was not even her own. She kept Thomas for 3 days until the wind dropped enough for Sarah to come for him. Sarah arrived on a horse that was trembling and wild-eyed from the cold, and she did not speak for a full minute after she saw her son alive and wrapped in blankets by the stove. "I thought he was dead," Sarah said. "I thought he went out and the wind took him and I would find him in the spring." He found the wall. Sarah looked at the wall. She pressed her hand against it the way she had in October, when she had told Ragna it was foolish. She did not say it was foolish now. She did not say anything. She just pressed her hand to the wood and held it there, and then she took Thomas home. The freeze ground on, the 5th week, the 6th. The temperature cycled between 20 below and 40 below.
with brief mocking rises to single digits that lasted just long enough to soften the top layer of snow before the next drop refroze it into a crust that cut through boot leather. Ragna's routine narrowed to its essentials. Feed the stove, count the wood, check the south draw point, check the children, sleep in fragments, melt snow for water because the well was frozen solid. Ration the flour, ration the potatoes, ration the preserved plums Sarah had brought in December, which now tasted like the memory of a world where people brought gifts. By the 7th week, she was burning from the structural wood, pieces that had been part of the wall's inner ring, load-bearing courses that she extracted with the careful precision of a surgeon removing stitches. Each piece she pulled meant the wall behind it was thinner. Each piece she burned meant one less layer between the cabin boards and the killing cold. She was eating her own shelter to feed her own fire, which was exactly what Sarah had predicted in October, and it was working anyway because the outer ring still held, and the drifts had done their work, and the wind, when it reached the cabin skin, had already spent its force on 6 feet of wood and 4 feet of packed snow. The wall was thinner, but it was still there, and the cold had to pass through all of it before it reached her children. The freeze did not break for another 31 days after Thomas's rescue. The cold loosened slowly through late January, tightened again in early February, and finally relented in the 3rd week of February when the wind shifted south and the temperature crawled above zero and the sky showed blue that was not metallic but soft. 62 days. Ragna counted them on the door frame below Ivor's armload marks. 62 days sealed inside the timber ring with 2 children, a failing east wall, 1 working draw point, and a fuel supply that she had managed so carefully that when the weather finally broke, she had 11 days of wood remaining. 11 days out of 90. She had survived with a margin so thin that a week of extra cold would have finished her. She had survived not by abundance but by precision, by counting every armload, by reclaiming wood from behind the packed drifts, as Halvore had taught her, by burning at 3.5 armloads when her neighbors burned 5 and 6, by never once opening the main door during the worst stretches except for the night she pulled Thomas Kittredge out of the drift. She opened the door on the 63rd morning and stood in the sunlight and felt the wind touch her face without trying to kill her. Ivor stood beside her. Marta leaned against the door frame, still thin from the fever but standing. The timber fort rose around them, half buried in drifts, its upper courses visible above the snow like the ribs of something ancient. The section road was gone under a smooth white plain. The smoke from the chimney rose into air that did not tear it sideways. The crisis was over. But the story was not. Because across the county, people were counting their own losses, the dead, the frostbitten, the structures that had failed, the methods that had not been enough, and they were going to want to know how a widow with $11 and a lame ox had outlasted the worst freeze in a decade inside a pile of firewood that everyone had called a coffin. The thaw came slowly, the way all things come on the plains, not as a single event, but as a long negotiation between the cold that wanted to stay and the sun that was done waiting. By the 1st week of March, the drifts were shrinking. The section road reappeared as a dark line of mud cutting through white. Smoke rose from chimneys across the county, and the smoke looked different now, lighter, thinner, the smoke of stoves that no longer had to fight. Ragna did not celebrate. She rationed. 11 days of wood meant 11 days, and March in Dakota was not spring. She burned 2 armloads a night instead of 3.5, and the cabin dropped cold enough that the water bucket froze again overnight, and she accepted that because accepting discomfort was cheaper than running out. The first visitor came on the 4th day of the thaw. Elias Brandt rode the gray mare up the section road at mid-morning, picking his way through mud and meltwater. He tied the mare and stood looking at the timber fort, the way a man looks at a building that should not exist. The fort had changed.
The north and west sides still rose above the remaining drifts, but the wood was weathered now, darkened by moisture, streaked with ice melt, the bark strips curling where the courses had settled. The east wall was visibly thinner, its upper courses missing where Halvore had restacked during the freeze and where Ragna had pulled structural wood in the 7th week. The south side was the most intact, its cribbing still tight, the draw point visible as a dark channel near the window. Brant walked the perimeter. He did not hurry. He pressed his hand against the wood at the corners the way he had pressed it against the tar paper in October. He crouched and examined the base courses where the meltwater was running. He went inside. The cabin was cold but dry. The stove was banked low. The bed platform held 3 sleeping shapes under heavy blankets. Ragna had been up since 4 feeding the fire and was sitting at the table with a cup of snowmelt water, watching Brant the way she had watched him 5 months earlier when he told her to leave. He stood in the center of the room and looked at the walls. He pressed his hand to the north boards, the killing wall, the one he had said would bleed heat through single-ply tar paper until it froze her children. The boards were cool, dry, no frost, no ice crystals, no condensation. The tar paper behind the timber ring had survived the winter without leaking because the wind had never reached it directly. The timber ring had absorbed the punishment, and the tar paper had simply existed behind it, untouched. Brant pulled his hand back. He looked at the stove, at the size of the firebox, at the short chimney he had criticized in October. "Your frost line is lower than any house I built this winter," he said, "including my own." "I know." "My mother's bed was in the center of the room by January. The north wall never stopped leaking heat. I have a sod bank, 3 feet, properly sloped. It was not enough. The sod bank does not stop the wind. It slows the cold, but the wind still reaches the boards above it and strips the heat from the upper wall. The wood stops the wind first. That is the difference." Brant was quiet for a long time. He was not a man who admitted error easily, because error in his profession meant buildings that failed and people who froze. His reputation was built on being right about structures, and being wrong about one, being wrong about this one, cost him something he could feel. "I was wrong about the wind," he said. He did not say he was wrong about everything. He did not say she was brilliant. He said he was wrong about the wind, and that was specific and honest, and it mattered more than a broad apology because it identified the exact point where his expertise had failed. "Your corners held," he said. "The cribbing is good work. Who taught you?" "Halvor Neschheim." "The sawyer." Brant nodded slowly. "He knows wood better than I gave him credit for." He stayed for an hour. He asked questions about the draw points, how wide, what angle, how she kept them clear. He asked about the burn rate. He asked about the east wall failure and the shift that closed the draw point. He listened to the answers the way a builder listens when he's learning something new, which is to say carefully and without interrupting. When he left, he shook Ragnar's hand. He had not done that in October. A week later, Ragnar heard from a freight driver that Brant had been seen stacking cottonwood rounds against the north wall of a cabin he was building for a new family on the far side of the Koto. Not a full ring, not the timber fort, but a windward side mass 4 feet deep with the bark turned outward. The freight driver said Brant had not mentioned Ragnar's name. He did not need to. The design spoke for itself. Sarah Kittredge did not need to visit. She had already seen the proof. Her own son had walked 3/4 of a mile in a whiteout and survived because he hit the timber ring instead of open prairie. But she came anyway, a week after Brant, with her 2 boys and a sack of seed potatoes she said she owed from the fall. She did not owe seed potatoes. It was a gift disguised as a debt, which was the only kind of gift pride allowed on the plains. Sarah walked the perimeter the way Brant had. She examined the cribbing. She peered into the south draw point. She went inside and pressed her hand to the north wall and held it there for a long time. I said you were stacking tomorrow's fire outside today's walls, Sarah said. I was wrong about that. You were stacking tomorrow's fire inside tomorrow's walls. The wall and the fire were the same thing. They were always the same thing. I just could not explain it well enough in October. You could not explain it because it sounds insane until you see it work. Sarah sat at the table and asked questions. Not skeptical questions, practical ones. How deep does the wall need to be on the windward side? Can you use sod between the courses to fill the gaps? What happens if you build the draw point on the north side instead of the south? How much wood do you lose to rot if the bark stays on? Ragna answered every question. She drew the cross-section on the flour sack, the same flour sack she had drawn the original plan on in October, and showed Sarah the layering, green wood outside, dry wood inside, draw points angled downward, capboard sloped for drainage. Sarah copied the drawing on a piece of brown paper. She folded it and put it in her coat. I'm not going to build the full ring, Sarah said. I can't cut that much wood, but I'm going to build a north wall and a west wall with a draw point, and I'm going to connect them to my shed so the path is covered. That will work. The wind side is what matters most. Thomas would be dead without your wall. Thomas would be dead without the wind that pushed him into it. I did not plan for that. No, but you planned for the wind. That is what I did not understand. Sarah left with the drawing and the beginning of a design that was not Ragna's design but was born from it, adapted, simplified, made practical for a household that could not build the full ring but could protect the killing sides and cover the path to the fuel. Others came. A young couple named Garrett, the same family whose children had been sent to gawk at the timber fort in October, arrived with questions about corner bracing. The husband had lost 2 toes to frostbite crossing his yard in January, and his wife had spent the worst week of the freeze-burning furniture because the woodshed path was impassable. An elderly widower named Soren Hugen, 71, rode 8 miles on a mule to see the fort. His knees were too damaged to make the woodshed trip more than once a day, and on the worst days he had not made it at all. He had survived by burning his bed frame, his table, and half his floorboards. He sat in Ragna's cabin and looked at the draw point and said nothing for a very long time, and then he said, I would have died if I had known about this and not built it. Ragna taught each of them. She taught through action. She took them to the wall and showed them the cribbing, the layering, the draw point angle. She let them feel the difference between the sheltered boards and the exposed ones. She answered their questions without condescension and without pride, because the method was not hers to own. It was physics. It was wind and wood and the spaces between them. The teaching itself became a rhythm. She would walk the visitor to the north wall and stand them with their back against the timber ring. Feel the quiet, she would say. Feel how the air behind you is not moving. Then she would walk them around to wherever the ring was thinnest, the east side, where the shed lumber reconstruction was only 3 feet deep, and stand them there. Feel the difference. That difference is what keeps you alive. Then she would take them inside and show them the draw point. She would reach through the channel and pull a log in while they watched. No door opened, no heat lost, no exposure to the storm. The wood came from the wall into the room like bread from an oven, built in, sheltered, available at the moment of greatest need. The Garrett husband, the one with the missing toes, came back 3 times. He measured everything. He brought a knotted string and used it to record the depths, the angles, the spacing of the crib courses. His wife stood beside him and drew the cross-section in a pocket journal. They were not casual visitors. They were people converting loss into knowledge because loss was the only teacher the plains respected. Soren Haugen came twice more before the snow returned. The second time he brought his nephew, a 20-year-old named Embret, who had the strength Haugen lacked. Ragna showed Embret the cribbing pattern and watched him build a practice corner from scrap pieces in her yard. His hands were clumsy at first, too much force, too little patience, but by the third attempt, the interlocking courses held. Haugen watched from his mule with an expression that was equal parts pride and grief. Pride in the boy learning, grief that the knowledge had come a winter too late for his own floorboards. Through all of this, one voice was absent. Amos Bell said nothing publicly about Ragna's survival. He said nothing about the timber fort or the people visiting the claim. He went quiet the way a man goes quiet when the story he has been telling about someone is contradicted by the facts, and he does not yet have a new story to replace it. But quiet was not the same as finished. Sarah told Ragna that Bell was saying privately that Ragna had only survived because the winter broke when it did. He said any shelter would have held if the freeze had ended in February. He said the margin was too thin, 11 days, and that proved the method was reckless, not clever. He was clinging to the last argument available to a man who had been wrong. That being right was a matter of luck rather than design. Spring came hard and fast that year. The snow melted in sheets, the creek flooded its banks, and the ground turned to a black mud that sucked at boots and hooves and wheel rims. Ragna dismantled the outer ring methodically, starting from the south side where the wood was least weathered. She sorted as she went, sound pieces restacked for next winter's inner ring, rotted pieces cut for immediate burning, structural pieces set aside for the improvement she was planning. The dismantling revealed the full cost of the winter. The north wall's outer courses were blackened with moisture and compressed by the drift that had packed against them. Several pieces had split lengthwise from the freeze-thaw cycle, their grain opened like mouths. The east wall's shed lumber was warped beyond reuse. The flat planks had cupped and twisted in ways that round logs never did, confirming what Halvore had said about the difference between milled wood and split wood under stress. But the inner courses, the ones that had sheltered behind the mass of the outer ring, were sound, dry, tight-grained, ready for another season. She stacked them under a tarp near the rebuilt woodshed site and counted 2.5 cords of reusable wood. A foundation for next winter's wall, earned by this winter's survival. Halvore came in April. He was thinner than he had been in November, and the cough that Ragna had noticed during his last visit to the fort had deepened into something persistent and wet. He did not mention it. He worked beside her the way he always did, quietly, precisely, with the economy of a man who had been handling wood for 50 years and no longer needed to think about where his hands went. They built the second draw point together. The east wall needed complete rebuilding after the winter's damage, and Ragna wanted a draw point on that side as well, a backup channel in case the south point failed in a future storm. Halvore designed it with a double angle, downward to shed water and slightly curved to deflect wind that might push through the thinner east wall. While they worked, Halvore talked. Not about technique, about himself. He told her about the Wisconsin timber camps, about the river drives where logs moved downstream in rafts that men rode standing up, about the day a jam broke loose and killed 2 men beside him, and he decided the rivers were done with him. He told her about his wife, who had left when the logging money stopped, and about the son he had not seen in 14 years who was somewhere in Minnesota, or maybe Iowa. He told her these things not as confession, but as context, the life that had made him the man who could look at a collapsing corner and know exactly what was wrong. Ragna told him about Rogaland, about the smokehouse and her father's hands on the wall, about Pater, who had been a good man and a better planner, and who had died because a load of cottonwood shifted on a bad road. She told him about the night she drew the design on the flour sack, and how her hand shook because the idea was either going to save her family or kill them, and she could not tell which. They talked the way people talk when they have earned each other's trust through shared work and do not need to perform. The conversation moved between silences that were comfortable. not empty. Halvor corrected Ivar's splitting technique without raising his voice. Marta brought him water, and he thanked her by name. In May, Halvor disagreed with Ragna for the first time. She wanted to build the east wall to the same depth as the north, 6 feet, because the east side had been the failure point in the freeze. Halvor said no. 3 feet with better cribbing and a covered access channel would hold, and the labor of 6 feet would cost her weeks she needed for planting.
"You are building for the worst storm you survived," he said. "Build for the worst storm you can imagine, and then add 1 course, no more. The wall does not need to be perfect. It needs to be enough." Enough nearly killed us.
Enough kept you alive. Perfect would have taken until December to build, and you would have frozen before you finished it. They argued for an hour. Ragna won the argument by compromise, 4 feet on the east side instead of 6 or 3. Halvor accepted it with a shrug that meant he thought she was wrong, but respected her right to be wrong on her own land. It was the only real disagreement they had. It mattered because it proved the relationship was not charity and not worship. It was a partnership between 2 people with different experiences who respected each other enough to fight about the work. Halvor's cough worsened through the summer. By August, it was bad enough that he could not ride the mule without stopping to spit blood into the grass. He came to the claim less often. When he came, he worked shorter hours and rested longer. Ragna did not ask him what was wrong because she could hear what was wrong, and asking would not change it. He came one last time in early September, when the first cold edge appeared in the morning air and the cottonwoods along the creek began to turn. He brought his draw knife, the good one, the one he had brought to the claim in November, and he gave it to Ivar. "This is not a gift," he told the boy. "It is a tool. You keep it sharp and you use it for the work, and when you are done with the work, you clean it and put it away. A draw knife is not a toy and it is not a weapon. It is a conversation between your hand and the wood." He sat on the chopping stump and watched Ragna and Ivar stacking the first courses of the rebuilt east wall. His breathing was audible from 20 feet away, a wet, shallow rasp that seemed too large for his thin chest. "Watch the corners," he said to Ivar, "not the faces. Structures tell the truth at the corners before they tell it anywhere else. People are the same. Watch where the joints meet. That is where the settling shows." He rode out at noon. Ragna walked beside the mule to the section road and held the bridle while Halvor adjusted his coat against the wind. "You don't need me for the east wall," he said. "You needed me for the first corner. Everything after the first corner is repetition." "I know." "The boy has good hands. Teach him the draw point angle. He will remember it longer than I explained it." "Halvor." "I am going home," he said. "That is all." He rode south. Ragna watched until the mule disappeared into the grass. The wind moved across the open ground, and the cottonwoods rattled their dry leaves, and somewhere along the creek a bird sang a phrase that sounded like a question with no answer. She did not go back to work immediately. She sat on the chopping stump where Halvor had sat and looked at the northwest corner of the timber fort, the first corner he had cribbed, the one he had built in 20 minutes while she watched and understood for the first time that the wall could hold if the joints were right. That corner had survived the 60-day freeze. It had survived the east wall's failure and the south wall's thinning and the slow consumption of the inner ring. It had survived because a 62-year-old sawyer with a missing finger and a cough in his chest had laid the courses with the patience of a man who knew that wood forgives many sins but not carelessness at the joints. She went back to the east wall and picked up the draw knife and held it the way Halvor held his tools, firm but not tight, the way you hold something that knows more than you do. Halvor Nesheim died in his dugout in late September of 1888. A passing freighter found him 2 days after. He was lying on his cot with his boots off, and his coat folded on the chair and his hands crossed on his chest. The freighter said the dugout was clean and the tools were hung on their pegs, and the stove was cold but recently swept. He had gone the way he had lived, alone, neat, without asking anyone for help. Ragna heard the news from Sarah, who heard it from the freighter at the store. She did not cry in front of the children. She went to the timber wall and stood with her hand pressed against the northwest corner. The first corner Halvore had cribbed, the one that had taught her the pattern that saved her family, and she stood there until the cold came through her palm and into her bones, and she could feel one last time what he had taught her about the difference between a wall that holds and a wall that pretends to. She told Ivor that evening. The boy held the drawn knife in his lap and turned it over and over, running his thumb along the edge that Halvore had kept sharp enough to shave with. He said to watch the corners, Ivor said. Yes. He said structures tell the truth there first. Yes. Does that mean people too? He thought so. Ivor put the draw knife on the shelf above the bed platform, blade facing the wall, the way Halvore stored his tools. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. The tool on the shelf said everything about what the man had meant to them and what his absence would cost. The wood was silent. The wind moved over it and did not get through. Halvore's work held the way his word held, without drama, without decoration, without asking to be noticed. The secondary crisis came 3 weeks after Halvore's death, as if the prairie had been waiting for Ragna to lose her teacher before testing her again. An early October blizzard, not the killing freeze, but a hard, fast storm with dropping temperatures and brutal wind, caught 3 households unprepared. The Garretts had not finished their windbreak wall. Soren Haugen's half-built north stack had slumped in a rainstorm, and he lacked the strength to restack it alone. A new family recently arrived had nothing at all, a sod house with a detached shed, and a path that would vanish in the first hour of heavy snow. Sarah rode to Ragna's claim through the leading edge of the storm. Her horse was blowing hard, and her face was red with cold and urgency. The Garrett's north wall fell. Haugen cannot lift the rounds. The new family, Nygaard, their name is, does not even know what is coming. They have been here 6 weeks. How long until the worst of it? Tonight, maybe sooner. Ragna looked at the sky. It was the color of iron, the same color it had turned in November before the first real snow. The wind was already picking up from the northwest. She made decisions the way Halvore made decisions, quickly, based on what the materials could do and what the time allowed. We cannot build full walls in a day. We build windbreaks, north side only, 3 feet deep, 4 feet high, enough to break the direct wind off the cabin walls and cover the path to the shed. That is the minimum that saves lives. She loaded Cors, whose leg had healed enough for short work, with tools and rope, and rode to the Garretts first. Ivor came with her. He was 10 now, lean and quiet and capable with the drawn knife. Marta stayed with Sarah's younger boy at the Kittredge place. At the Garretts, Ragna restacked the fallen north wall in 2 hours. She did not build it to her own standard. There was no time for the full cribbing pattern. She built it fast, leaning the courses inward at double the normal angle so the weight locked immediately, and she braced the corners with fence posts driven into the softening ground. It was ugly. It would hold for a storm. It would not hold for a winter. At Haugen's, the work was harder. The old man's rounds were heavier than what Ragna usually handled, full cottonwood trunks barely split, too thick for proper interlocking. She and Ivor wrestled them into a rough windbreak on the north side while Haugen sat on his step and watched with the helpless fury of a man whose body had betrayed his mind. I should be doing this, he said. You will do the next one, Ragna said. In spring, When the ground is soft and the wood is dry, we will build it right. Today we build it fast. Haugen's nephew Embret appeared on the horseback as they finished the last course. He had ridden from his own claim 4 miles east when Sarah's boy brought word of the storm. He was young and strong and willing, and Ragna used him. "Go to the Newgards," she said. "Take the rope from the back of my saddle. I will meet you there." The Nygards were the most urgent. They had no windbreak, no covered path, and a woodpile that sat 30 paces from their sod house in open ground. The husband, Bjarne Nygard, was a tall, uncertain man who had come from Trondheim 3 months earlier and had never experienced a plains winter. Ragna did not have time to build him a wall. She had time to do one thing. She rigged a rope line from the sod house door to the woodpile, anchored at both ends with stakes driven deep, and she stacked what loose wood she could find directly against the north face of the sod house. Not a proper wall, not interlocking courses, just a mass of wood leaned against the sod to break the wind at the most critical point. Embret hauled the heavier pieces while Ragna directed the placement, calling corrections through the rising wind. The Nygard wife, a small, sharp-eyed woman named Christie, who had not spoken until now, came out with a question that stopped Ragna mid-sentence. "How do I know when the wind is too bad to go out?" Ragna looked at her. It was the smartest question anyone had asked her all day. "When you cannot see the rope from the door, do not go out. Send your husband. When he cannot see the woodpile from the middle of the rope, he comes back and you burn what you have inside. You do not make the trip if you cannot see the next anchor point." Christie nodded once. She went inside and came back with a strip of red cloth, which she tied to the midpoint of the rope line, a marker, a visible check against the invisible. "That is good," Ragna said. And it was. It was the kind of practical adaptation that turned a survival principle into a living method, someone else's intelligence applied to someone else's problem. The knowledge was spreading, and it was changing as it spread, and that was how it was supposed to work. "When the storm comes, follow the rope," she told Nygard. "Do not let go of it. Do not try to see through the snow. Just follow the rope. Get the wood. Follow the rope back. Do not make 2 trips when one will do." "How bad will it be?" "Bad enough that you will not find the woodpile without the rope. A man died this winter 22 yards from his own cabin because he could not see. 22 yards. Nygard looked at the rope. He looked at the wood piled against his north wall. He looked at Ragna, a woman smaller than him, thinner than him, standing in a rising wind with her son beside her, and the authority of someone who had survived what he was about to face. "Thank you," he said. "Thank me in spring when you're still here." The storm hit that night. It was not the 60-day freeze. It was 3 days of hard wind and heavy snow and temperatures that dropped to 20 below. It was enough to test every structure in the county and enough to prove which ones had been prepared. The garret's restacked wall held. Haugen's rough windbreak held. The Nygards survived by following the rope line and burning the wood Ragna had stacked against their north wall. Nobody died. Nobody lost fingers. Nobody burned their furniture. If this story reminds you why preparation matters and why one person's knowledge can change a whole community, share it with someone who needs to hear it. When the storm broke, Ragna rode back to her own claim and found the timber fort standing as it had stood through the 60-day freeze. The rebuilt east wall had held. Both draw points were clear. Iver had kept the stove fed and the count going. The marks on the door frame showed 3 armloads per night. She had done what Halvore would have done. She had read the materials, assessed the time, and built what the situation allowed. She had not built perfectly. She had built enough. Enough was the lesson. Enough was always the lesson.
Halvor had told her that in May, and she had argued, and he had been right, and now he was gone, and the lesson remained. Across the county, people were not talking about the timber fort as a joke anymore. They were talking about it as a method. The word had shifted from mockery to inquiry. How deep on the north side? What angle for the draw point? Can sod be mixed with the stacking? How do you read the settlement at the corners? Ragna answered every question the same way Halvor had answered hers, through action, through demonstration, through the patient repetition of principles that were simple to state and difficult to execute. She was no longer a widow surviving. She was a builder teaching. The transition had happened not through declaration, but through accumulation, one wall restacked, one draw point explained, one rope line strung, one storm survived because someone knew what the wind could do and built against it. The names accumulated too. The Garretts, Haugen, and Embret, the Nygaards, Sarah Kittredge, whose adapted windbreak and covered path design was already being copied by a family 2 sections south, Thomas Kittredge, who had survived because he hit a wall that should not have existed, and who now helped his mother stack her own north wall with the focus of a boy who remembered what it felt like to be lost. Each name was a household. Each household was a winter that would be different because of what Ragna had built and what she was willing to teach. The knowledge moved outward from her claim like heat from a stove, slowly, through contact, warming whatever it touched. Amos Bell had not spoken publicly about any of this. His silence was louder than his mockery had been. Sarah said he had been seen walking behind his store, measuring the distance from his back door to his woodshed, standing there in the wind with his hands in his pockets and his face unreadable. He had not built a wall. He had not strung a rope. He had not asked Ragna for help, but he had measured the distance. And measuring was the first thing Ragna had done too. The second winter on the claim was not the first winter. It was not 60 days of unbroken freeze with a sick child and a failing east wall and 11 days of margin. It was an ordinary Dakota winter, hard, long, cold enough to kill the careless, and Ragna met it with a timber ring that was better than the year before in every way that mattered. The improvements came from lessons paid for in fear. The east wall was 4 feet deep now, rebuilt with split rounds instead of shed lumber, cribbed at the corners the way Halvor had taught her. 2 draw points instead of 1, south and east, each angled downward with the narrow outside, wide inside design that kept the wind from pushing through. The north wall was restacked with the sound inner wood from last year's ring, supplemented by new cottonwood from the creek belt. She had cut and hauled 7 cords before October, working with Ivor and with cores, whose leg had finally healed enough for steady pulling. She added refinements that the first year's desperation had not allowed time for. A shallow, ventilated gap between the innermost course and the cabin wall, 2 finger widths of airspace that kept moisture from wicking from the wood into the boards. A separate emergency wood pocket near the bed platform, packed with the driest kindling she had, enough to restart a dead fire without opening any draw point. A dismantling plan for spring. The south wall came down first, the east second, the north last, so the windward protection stayed in place until the danger had fully passed. She also built a covered channel from the cabin door to the privy, not timber ring deep, but a waist-high windbreak of stacked wood on both sides with scrap boards across the top. It was 20 feet long, and it meant that for the first time in 2 winters, the children could reach the privy without stepping into the open wind. Marta, now 7, called it the tunnel. Ivor, now 10, called it the path. Ragna called it the reason she had stacked the extra half cord that Halvor would have told her was unnecessary. She thought about Halvor every time she set a course. Every time she tested a corner by pressing her ear to the wood and listening for the whistle of moving air, Every time Ivor used the draw knife to shave a piece to fit, and the shaving curled off the blade in a long, pale ribbon, the way Halvore's shavings had curled. Clean, even, the sign of a sharp edge meeting the grain at the right angle. The ghost of his teaching was in every joint. The cribbing pattern, the inward lean, the separation of firewood from weatherwood, the draw point angle, the principle of enough. She carried his lessons the way she carried the memory of her father's smokehouse, not as something learned, but as something absorbed, built into the way her hands moved and her eyes read the settlement at the corners. The second winter passed. Nobody in the cabin got sick. The stove burned at 3 armloads a night. The draw points stayed open, the corners held. The marks on the door frame Ivor still kept the count, showed a steady rhythm that did not spike and did not falter. It was not dramatic. It was not heroic. It was a family living through winter the way winter ought to be lived through, with preparation, with method, and with enough. By the 3rd year, the timber fort had stopped being Ragna's private solution and had become a local practice. Sarah Kittredge's windbreak and covered path design was the most common adaptation. 3 families built versions of it that fall, each one slightly different, each one fitted to the specific weaknesses of their cabin and the specific direction of their prevailing wind. Sarah helped with the design. She had become, without intending it, Ragna's translator, the practical neighbor who could take the full timber ring concept and scale it down to something a family with less wood and less time could manage. The Garretts built a full north and west ring, 4 feet deep, with a single draw point. It was the closest copy of Ragna's original design, and the Garrett husband, walking on 9 toes now, treated it with the reverence of a man who understood what the alternative looked like. Embret Haugen built his uncle Soren a proper wall that fall, 3 feet deep on the north side, 2.5 on the west, with the cribbing pattern Ragna had taught him in her yard. Soren survived the 3rd winter without burning any furniture. He died the following spring of causes unrelated to cold, but he died in a house that was intact, and that mattered to him. The Nygaards, the family who had arrived with nothing and survived the October storm on a rope line and a leaned pile of wood, built the most inventive version. Bjarne Nygaard, who turned out to be a better builder than his first bewildered months had suggested, combined the timber ring principle with the sod construction of his house. He stacked wood against the sod on the windward sides, but packed sod between the courses, creating a hybrid wall that was heavier, denser, and slower to shed heat than either material alone. It was ugly, and it worked, and Ragna told him so. Bjarne did not stop there. By the 3rd winter, he had added a detail that Ragna had not thought of, a small iron grate set into the draw point channel that caught bark fragments and wood dust before they could blow into the cabin. It was a refinement born from experience. His wife Christy had spent hours sweeping debris from the channel every time the wind shifted, and it was the kind of improvement that only comes from someone living with the design, not just building it. Christy Nygaard's red cloth still hung on the rope line. She had added 2 more, one at the woodpile end, one at the door, 3 markers in the white, 3 points of certainty in a world that the wind could erase. Other families copied the markers. By the 3rd winter, red cloths on rope lines were visible across the district, a quiet network of color against the snow that meant the same thing everywhere. Someone lives here. Someone is prepared. Someone learned. Ragna watched the adaptation spread and felt something she had not expected. Not pride exactly, but recognition. The knowledge was no longer hers. It belonged to the wind and the wood, and the people who had learned to read the space between them. Each version was different. Each version was correct. The principle held even when the execution changed, because the principle was simple: stop the wind before it reaches the wall, keep the fuel within reach, Never cross open ground when the air's trying to kill you, and simple principles survive translation. On a clear October morning in the third year, Ragna stood at the section road and counted the smoke columns she could see. 7. She could identify 5 of them by the shape of the structures beneath them. 3 had timber walls visible from the road. 2 had covered paths. 1, the Newgards, had the hybrid sodden wood construction that looked like a hill with a chimney. 7 households burning steadily on an October morning, with winter coming and nobody panicking. That was the legacy, not a monument, a practice. Amos Bell's reckoning came in the third winter, and it came not from Ragna, but from the weather. The December of 1889 brought a storm that hit Ordway directly, not the open prairie where the homestead sat, but the town itself. The wind drove snow into the main street so thick that Bell could not see his own store sign from the porch. The temperature dropped to 31 below. The store's woodshed behind the building was separated from the back door by 40 paces of open ground, the same 40 paces Ragna had asked him about in the confrontation 2 years earlier. Bell's clerk, Reese, the one who had lost the use of 2 fingers in the first freeze, refused to make the trip. He stood at the back door and looked at the white void and said he would not go out there again. Not for wood, not for anything. Bell went himself. He made it to the shed. He loaded his arms. He turned around and could not see the store. The back door had disappeared into the blowing snow. 40 paces. The same distance that had killed the bachelor Lund. The same distance that had nearly killed Thomas Kittredge. The same distance Ragna had called out to him across the store counter while Ivor stood behind her and the men by the stove looked at their boots. Bell stood in the wind with an armload of wood and felt for the first time the exact terror that the timber fort had been built to prevent. He was 40 paces from safety, and he could not see it, and the cold was already closing on his hands, and the wood was heavy, and the wind was pushing him sideways, and every second he stood still was a second closer to the point where standing still became lying down. The wood in his arms was not enough for the night. Even if he made it back, he would have to come out again, and again, and again. Every time the stove burned down and the store went cold, he would have to open the back door and walk into that white blindness and gamble 40 paces against the same odds that had killed a homesteader and crippled his own clerk. He understood the math now, not as an argument to be dismissed across a store counter, but as a physical experience, the weight of the wood, the distance of the door, the speed of the cold, the invisibility of the path. He understood it the way Ragna had understood it the day she pressed her hand against the south wall and felt the difference between sheltered boards and exposed ones, not as theory, as truth. He found the door by luck, by the angle of the drift, by the memory of his own back steps, which he counted with the desperate precision of a man who has just understood that counting is not a metaphor, but a survival tool. He made it inside. He dropped the wood on the floor and stood shaking by the stove, and Reese looked at him and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the experience had not already said. The next morning, Bell walked to the lumberyard. He bought cottonwood rounds and fence posts. He spent 2 days stacking wood against the back wall of his store. Not a timber ring, not a full windbreak, but a mass of fuel piled against the building so that the back door opened into wood instead of distance. It was crude. It was practical. It was Ragna's idea executed by the man who had called it immigrant foolishness. He did not tell anyone what he had built or why. But Ordway was a small town, and small towns notice when the storekeeper starts piling firewood against his own building, the same way the widow he mocked had piled it against hers. Sarah told Ragna. Ragna said nothing. She did not need to say anything. The wood against Bell's wall said it for her. The full confrontation, the resolution of 2 years of hostility, came in late January,
when Bell rode out to Ragna's claim on a matter of business, the spring seed note, the $9, the debt that had hung over the claim since Peter's death. Bell sat his horse in front of the timber fort and looked at it. He had never seen it up close. He had mocked it from the store porch and from the safe distance of gossip, but he had never stood in its shadow and felt the scale of it, the sheer mass of interlocking wood rising above the cabin roof, the draw points framed like windows into the wall, the covered path running from the door to the privy, the whole structure radiating the quiet competence of something built by someone who understood what they were building. He dismounted and tied the horse. Ragna came out. Eivor stood behind her in the doorway, Halvore's draw knife in his belt the way other boys carried slingshots. "The note is due in April," Bell said. "I know. You have the wheat to cover it?" "I have the wheat. I have the seed. I have more than enough." Bell did not go inside. He stood in the yard and looked at the timber ring the way a man looks at something he has to reconcile with a story he has been telling himself for 2 years. The story had been simple. The widow was reckless. The method was foolish. The survival was luck. Standing in front of the wall, feeling the wind break against it and roll over its surface and die in the still air behind it, the story did not hold. He walked to the north wall. He pressed his hand against the cribbing at the corner, the northwest corner, Halvore's corner, the first one built and the last one standing every spring. The wood was cold and smooth and absolutely still. No vibration, no draft, no movement of air through the joints. The wall was doing what walls are supposed to do, and it was doing it better than anything Bell had built or sold or financed in 14 years of frontier commerce. "Who stacked this corner?" he asked. "A man named Halvor Neschheim. He's dead now." "The sawyer from the dugout?" "Yes." "It's good work." He pulled his hand back. "It's the best cribbing I've seen on the plains." He was quiet for a while. The wind moved over the wall and made no sound. "I stacked wood against my store," he said. "I heard. I stood in my own yard in that storm, and I could not find my own door. 40 paces. I had an armload of wood, and I could not see 10 feet. He took his hat off and held it in both hands, turning it by the brim. "You told me, in the store. You asked me how many steps to my woodpile, and I stood there behind my own counter and told you it was not the same thing. You said it was immigrant foolishness. I said that too. You mentioned my husband." Bell's face changed. The hardness that he wore like a storefront, the calculating look that made him good at lending and bad at kindness, cracked along a line that ran from his eyes to his jaw. "I should not have said that. I knew it when I said it, and I said it anyway because you were right, and I did not want you to be right. A widow with an accent telling me about distance in my own store in front of my own customers. I could not let that stand, so I said something cruel instead of something true." He looked at Eivor, who was watching from the doorway with the flat, careful expression of a boy who remembers. "I'm sorry," Bell said. "To you as well." Eivor did not respond. He looked at his mother. Ragna nodded once, a small nod that meant the apology was heard and would be weighed, and that the weighing was not Bell's to rush. "The note is forgiven," Bell said. "You owe me nothing." Ragna did not thank him. Thanking him would have meant accepting that forgiveness was a gift rather than a debt repaid. The note had been leverage, and Bell had used it as leverage, and forgiving it was not generosity. It was acknowledgement. "I will still pay it," Ragna said, "in wheat, in April." "You don't have to." "I know. I will pay it because I owe it. That is how debts work." Bell put his hat back on. He looked at the timber fort one more time. The wind was blowing from the northwest, steady and cold, and the wall caught it and held it, and the cabin behind it sat in stillness. They called it the timber fort, he said. I know what they called it. It was not a fort, it was a house, a real house. He rode back to town. Ragna watched him go the way she had watched Brant go 2 years earlier, without satisfaction, without anger, with the neutral recognition that a thing had been settled, and the settling had taken exactly as long as it needed to take. Aslak Moen arrived in the spring of 1890, when the proving up period on Ragna's claim was nearing its end, and the cabin needed work that went beyond wood and wind.
He was 39, a blacksmith by training and a repairman by necessity, born in Bergen and weathered by 12 years of moving between frontier towns, fixing what other people broke. He came to Ordway because the livery needed a smith, and the smith they had was leaving for Montana. He came to Ragna's claim because Sarah Kittredge told him the widow on the Tavate section needed hinge work and stovepipe repair and would pay in wheat. He arrived on a Tuesday with a portable forge strapped to a pack mule and an expression that suggested he had been told about the timber fort and did not believe what he had been told. He believed it by Wednesday. The hinge work took an hour. The stovepipe repair took 2. The conversation took the rest of the day. Aslak walked the perimeter of the timber ring the way every visitor did, but he asked different questions. Not about the wood, about the iron. Where the draw-point frames met the cabin wall, the hardware was failing. The hinges on the access channel covers were bent from the freeze-thaw cycle. The capboard brackets needed resetting. He fixed them. He fixed them with the easy competence of a man who understood metal the way Halvore had understood wood, not theoretically but physically, through his hands, through the sound the hammer made on the anvil, and the color the iron turned in the forge. Ragna watched him work. She watched the way his hands moved, deliberate, patient, certain. She watched the way he talked to Ivor, explaining the tempering process without condescension, letting the boy hold the tongs while the bracket cooled. She watched the way Marta brought him water, and he drank it standing, the way working men drink without sitting down. He came back the following week to repair the stove grate. The week after that, he came to fit new brackets on the east draw point. The week after that, he came without a repair to justify the visit. The courtship was quiet and practical, the way frontier courtships were. It happened through shared labor. Aslak forged hardware for the timber ring. Ragna fed him at her table. They talked about iron and wood and the properties of materials under stress. And the conversation was not romantic in the way that word is usually meant, but it was intimate in the way that matters. 2 people discovering that they understood the same things in the same language. The first time Ragna knew it was something more than professional was a morning in July when Aslak arrived early, before the heat, and found her re-cribbing a section of the north wall where the winter settlement had loosened the lower courses. He set down his tools and joined her without asking what needed doing. He read the wall the way she read it, by looking at the corners, by pressing his hand to the courses, by listening for the gaps. He found a split piece she had missed and pulled it before the weight above it shifted. Halvor taught you this, he said. It was not a question. Yes. He was a good teacher. He was a good man who happened to teach. Aslak looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation required. Then he went back to the wall, and they worked in silence for 2 hours, and the silence was the kind that builds things rather than the kind that avoids them. Ivor accepted Aslak the way children accept evidence, slowly, by observation, with the reservation withdrawn only when the proof was sufficient. The proof came when Aslak made Ivor a set of splitting wedges from an old wagon axle, 3 wedges, graduated in size, with handles shaped to fit a boy's grip. He presented them without ceremony, the way Halvor had presented the draw knife, not a gift, a tool. Marta accepted him faster. She liked the forge. She liked the way the iron changed color in the heat,
cherry red to orange to the pale yellow that meant it was ready to shape. Aslak let her work the bellows, which was a job that required patience and rhythm, and Marta had both. They married in the fall of 1890. The circuit preacher said words. Sarah Kittredge stood witness. Amos Bell, who had been invited because not inviting him would have been a pettiness Ragna did not want to carry, sat in the back row and said nothing and left before the meal. The wedding was small and practical, like everything on the plains. The food was contributed by neighbors. The decorations were wildflowers in a tin cup. The best gift came from Elias Brandt, who arrived without being invited, and presented Ragna with a brass door latch he had ordered from a catalog. Proper hardware for a proper house, he said. And the word proper meant something different coming from him now than it would have meant 2 years earlier. Aslak did not save Ragna. He joined a life she had already built. His strength was not rescue, it was addition. The forge and the anvil and the repairman's knowledge of metal filled the gap that wood alone could not close. Where Ragna understood grain and weight and the behavior of wood under compression, Aslak understood the points of connection, the hinges, the brackets, the fastenings that held disparate materials together. Together they built what neither could have built separately, a homestead that was not just surviving but accumulating, tools, improvements, knowledge, the slow accretion of a life that was becoming durable. Their partnership had the rhythm of complementary skills. Ragna designed. Aslak engineered the joints. She said where the draw point should go. He built the frame that held it open. She read the settlement at the corners. He forged the braces that kept the settlement from becoming collapse. It was not a division of labor along the lines the world expected, the man building, the woman tending. It was a division along the lines of competence, and competence did not respect the boundaries that gender was supposed to enforce. The years compressed. The cabin gained a proper addition, a second room, sod-walled, with Aslak's ironwork at every joint. The timber ring became seasonal, built up in October, partially dismantled in April, the sound wood stored for next year, the damaged pieces burned. Ivor grew tall and quiet and capable, and by 14 he could crib a corner as fast as Halvore had. Marta grew into a sharp-eyed girl who kept the household accounts and could calculate burn rates in her head. A second child came in 1891, a boy named Peter, after the man who had brought them to the land. A third in 93, a girl named Sigri, who had her mother's hands and her father's patience with materials. The homestead accumulated the marks of durability. A proper barn replaced the old lean-to. A deeper well with a pump that Aslak fitted with brass valves he forged himself. A summer kitchen separate from the main house, connected by a covered walkway that was, in spirit, the same principle as the covered path to the privy, shelter the distance, protect the crossing. Each fall, when the stacking began, it became a communal event. Sarah Kittredge's boys came to help. Embret Haugen came. The Garrett family sent their oldest son, who was learning the cribbing pattern the way Ivor had learned it, by doing it, by making mistakes, by restacking the mistakes until the corners held. Ragna supervised, corrected, and occasionally took the draw knife from whoever was holding it to show them the angle Halvor had shown her. The stacking days became something more than labor. They became the event where knowledge was passed. New families learned the method not from Ragna's instruction alone, but from watching experienced builders work, watching the way Ivor tested a corner by pressing his ear to the wood, the way Sarah's boy Thomas read the grain to decide which face went outward, the way Embret sorted pieces by length before he started a course so the interlocking pattern would not require forcing. The knowledge lived in the doing. It could not be written down any more than the sound of a sharp draw knife meeting the right grain could be written down. It had to be felt. Aslak worked the hardware, the draw point frames, the cap board brackets, the hinge plates on the access channels. His forge sat in the yard during stacking season,
and the sound of the hammer on the anvil mixed with the sound of wood being laid into place. And the two sounds together, iron and timber, were the sound of a household that had made its peace with the winter and intended to keep making it year after year for as long as the land required. The timber fort became, over time, less a structure and more an idea. Each year the ring was slightly different, adjusted for the previous winter's lessons, refined by Aslak's hardware, expanded or contracted based on the wood supply. It was never the same design twice because the wind was never the same threat twice. The principle held, the execution adapted. That was the method. By the mid-90s, versions of the timber ring or its components were visible on at least 8 claims within a day's ride of the Tveit Moen homestead. Some were full rings, some were north wall only windbreaks, some were Sarah Kittredge's covered path design. One was the Nygaard's sod and wood hybrid, which Bjarne had refined into something that looked permanent and solid, and nothing like the desperate lean pile of the first October storm. None of them were famous. None of them were documented in the way that famous innovations are documented. They were local knowledge, passed hand to hand, adapted to each site, remembered in the muscles of the people who built them, and in the marks on the door frames where children counted armloads through the night. Ragna proved up the claim in 1890. The land was hers, not the government's, not the bank's, not Amos Bell's. Hers, in her name, earned by 5 years of improvement and survival. The paper said 160 acres. The paper did not say what it had cost, or what it had taught, or how many people had learned from what it had forced her to build. She held the proving up certificate in the same hands that had split open at the thumb webs on the 3rd day of cutting, the same hands that had pulled Thomas Kittredge out of the drift, the same hands that had pressed against the northwest corner after Halvor died. The paper was light. The hands were heavy with everything they had carried. Elias Brandt built timber ring windbreaks into 3 more houses that year. He never called them by Ragna's name. He called them wind walls, which was accurate and which avoided the question of credit. But everyone knew, and Brandt knew they knew, and that was enough for everyone, because on the plains, the knowledge mattered more than the naming. Sarah Kittredge's covered path design became so common along the Missouri Coteau that newcomers assumed it was standard construction. They did not know it had started with a widow's flour sack drawing and a Norwegian smokehouse memory and a sawyer who listened to walls. They did not need to know. They needed the path. They needed the wall. They needed the wood within reach when the wind erased the world. In the years after the Great Freeze, at least 8 families within a day's ride of the Tveit claim adopted versions of Ragna's method. Full encircling walls, north side sacrificial stacks, sheltered draw points, covered paths to outbuildings. The spread was local, practical, and undocumented in any official record. No surveyor noted the timber rings. No newspaper reported the method. It lived in the way that most useful knowledge lives on a frontier, in the hands of the people who needed it, passed forward by demonstration, altered by each new builder, remembered not as theory, but as practice. Ragna Tveit Moen lived out her later years on the same Dakota land she had nearly lost in widowhood. She was not remembered as a symbol or a legend. She was remembered as the woman who made winter negotiable, who looked at the killing distance between a cabin and a woodshed and decided to eliminate it, and who taught anyone who asked how to do the same. Halvor's draw knife hung on the wall of the main house until Ivar took it to his own claim in 1904. Ragna died in 1912 in the second room that Aslak had built, with her children and grandchildren nearby, and the timber ring outside dismantled for the season, and the wood stacked clean and dry for the fall. On the 16th of December, 1887, the sky turned hard blue, and the wind stopped, and the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 8 hours, and the 60-day freeze closed over the Dakota plains like a fist. A storekeeper in Ordway had told anyone who would listen that the widow on the Tveit section had buried her house in firewood like a giant termite nest, and that the pile would be her coffin.
62 days later, the wind shifted south and the freeze broke, and a woman opened a door inside a ring of stacked wood and stood in the sunlight with her children alive behind her and 11 days of fuel still in the wall. The storekeeper stacked wood against his own building the following winter and never spoke of termite nests again. The widow's hand reached through the draw point one more time, pulling a dry log from the wall that everyone thought was foolish, and the smoke rose clean from the chimney into air that was finally still. The wind had spent itself on the wood first. By the time it reached her walls, it had nothing left.